Chapter 5, Night Wanderer. Tiffany's earlier concerns about the state of the basement were proving valid. There indeed were a lot of spiders, daddy long legs, and hairy ones whose names she didn't know. Her understanding of basic biology, thanks to Mr. Knight, her grade 11 science teacher, made her wonder how so many spiders could survive in the basement without an obvious food source. She hadn't seen any flies or moths, their usual prey. Maybe there were other creatures down here in the half-submerged foundation, normally unseen by human eyes, during brief sorties to do laundry. Bugs and other creepy things for spiders to eat. By the time she had finished putting her room together, she had envisioned a complete, diverse, and thriving ecosystem of insects eating other insects in all around her new bedroom. She ended up cursing Mr. Knight. Sometimes a little education can be a bad thing. It was already late in the evening when they were expecting this errant guy any time now. Granny Ruth had spent the day puttering around the house, making sure everything was spick and span. Meanwhile, Tiffany concluded the worst day of her life by massaging her ego and trying to create a habitable place downstairs. Sadly, her new bedroom lacked certain graces. The walls were made of green carpeting, of which 2 large rolls had been left downstairs after the house had been renovated 8 years ago. Her dad had cut them up and hung them from the beam of the unfinished ceiling, stimulating plush walls. He'd also stapled some to the overhead beams and laid some on the bare cement floor. Tiffany felt like she was living in a fuzzy green box. She tried to Tiffanysize it with some posters and personal treasures from happier times, but she had to face fact that there was only so much you can do with green carpeted walls. As it was, Tiffany realized the thin layer of shade was all that was protecting her from a potential spider onslaught. "Tiffany, I'm going to make some tea. Would you like some? It will help you sleep." It was Granny Ruth yelling downstairs. Tiffany had never understood how anything with caffeine could help you sleep, but Granny Ruth had spent decades sleeping on a cup of tea before bedtime. Instead, Tiffany finished tucking in the corners of her bed, which was nestled against the wall just below the electrical box, before running upstairs. "No thanks, I'm heading out." As she emerged from the darkness of the basement, her grandmother gave her a strange look. Then she chuckled to herself. "What?" asked Tiffany. "You got a Michigan wobbin in your hair. You look old to me." Tiffany glanced in the mirror beside the refrigerator and saw her reflection. There seemed to be a fibrous gray cocoon around her head. She was indeed covered in cobwebs. What was even scarier was it did make her look much like her grandmother. "Son of a bitch." Granny Ruth raised an eyebrow at the inappropriate language as her granddaughter disappeared into the bathroom, grumbling. It seemed the spiders had won the first battle of the war, but if she hurried, Tony wouldn't get a chance to see her as a casualty. She combed vigorously to get the silk threads out of her hair. One last energetic shake of her head and all the evidence seemed to be gone. "Tiffany, did you just swear?" It was her father, coming in through the back door. "I could hear you all the way outside. You know I don't like swearing in this house." Tiffany grabbed her jacket and put it on. "Maybe move me out of the basement and there'll be less of a chance of me swearing. Any more swearing and you'll be living permanently down there." He saw she was putting on her shoes. "Where are you going?" "Out." There was an ominous pause. The only sound to be heard was the zipper of her jacket. "We have a guest coming any minute." "No, Dad, you have a guest coming any minute. I have a date coming any minute." Granny Ruth straightened out the collar of her jacket. "I thought you, Darla, and Kim were going to do something tonight. That's what you said last weekend." "God damn it." For the second time that night, Tiffany swore in her father's house, and for the second time, Keith glared at his daughter. It was like he didn't recognize her anymore. "Was that tonight? What's wrong with me?" "Well, I'm seeing Tony tonight. They can find something fun to do without me. They're grown-ups. They don't need me babysitting." "But they're your wigwaday," said Granny Ruth, using an Anishinaabe word for friends. Almost as if on cue, lights from the outside flooded into the living room through the large window, and midnight's familiar bark announced that someone had just pulled in the driveway. The old woman frowned. There was nothing wrong with a girl like Tiffany having a boyfriend, but it should never take time away from her girlfriends, and recently Tiffany had been seeing less and less of them. Darla and Kim were her best friends, ever since any of them could remember. Now it was like Tiffany was abandoning them for this boy. Keith glanced out the window and saw Tony's car. "It's late," he grumbled, "and it's going to get later. I gotta go." Before Keith or Granny Ruth could respond, Tiffany ran out, leaving behind only the echo of a slamming door as evidence she had ever been there. Both Keith and Granny watched her run down the driveway towards the young man's car. Keith was silent, but his brooding face made little guesswork of what he was thinking. He was not a happy man. Arguments and separate agendas were common between parents and child, but Claudia's departure and lack of money had multiplied the impact of what might have been considered normal family squabbles. Even on the clearest, sunniest days, it was as if there was a black cloud hanging over them. Granny Ruth watched Tiffany get into Tony's car. "It's not so bad. It's Friday night. No more school. Let her have her fun." Keith watched as Tony's brake lights disappeared as he pulled onto the main road through the village. Friday night, a 16-year-old having fun. Not a good combination. Granny Ruth poured 2 cups of tea. "I remember a lot of Friday nights. A 16-year-old boy and some fun. You survived and so did I. Do you want some Zimbabwe?" This always amazed Keith. "Mom, you've been making tea for both of us for 40 years, and you don't know if I take sugar?" She blew slightly on her tea, cooling it. "Calm down. It gives us something to talk about." In the car, Tiffany greeted Tony, but fell silent as she ran all the traumatic events of this afternoon and evening through her mind. And while her grandmother was far more religious than she was, Tiffany was convinced God had something against her. What else would explain all the cruel and inhuman events that were happening in her life? At least there was Tony, and if God was responsible for that, too, Tiffany wished she would make up her mind about how to treat her. It was all way too inconsistent. Once they left the reserve, she perked up. "We still going to Danielle's party?" Tony smiled. "What else is there to do on a Friday night? Got some beers, parents aren't expecting me home till late, and there's a bush party. Sounds good to me. What do you think?" He honked the horn in anticipation. "Hey, turn on some music." Tiffany smiled too. Tony's car was a sanctuary. It delivered her from her inconsiderate family and took her to places where she could have fun. And Tony was always behind the wheel. On second thought, it was indeed a good life. She hit a button on the car stereo and Nickelback flooded the car. It was a good omen because this was one of Tony's favorite songs. Excellent. He reached over and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The night might be salvaged after all. Ahead, they both saw 2 headlights cresting the highway. The car was heading towards a reserve. Light from the volunteer fire hall illuminated the approaching vehicle. "Hey, look," said Tony. "It's one of those new Camrys." Tiffany was not normally a car person, but if Tony was, then she'd learn. The car roared past them like a bat out of hell. Tony watched in the rear view mirror. "Do you know them?" Tiffany shook her head. Nope. She didn't care about Camrys, strangers in her room, or anything else. Tonight was a party. She cranked up the tunes and they both started to bob their heads to the music. The Dodge Sunrise drove off into the night. Destination? Anywhere but Otter Lake.